Eleanor's hand flew to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs as she stared at the impossible sight before her. The roses, ancient bushes that hadn't bloomed since the harsh winter 3 years ago, now burst with deep crimson petals that seemed to glow in the fading afternoon light. Her left knee, which had ached every morning since her 70th birthday, felt strong and limber. She flexed her fingers, marveling at joints that moved without their familiar stiffness. "Lucy, Thomas," she called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Come here, now." But the twins were already settling cross-legged on either side of the stranger, their small hands digging into their backpacks with the efficient determination of children on a mission. Lucy produced her peanut butter sandwich, carefully unwrapping the plastic while Thomas offered a juice box with a bendy straw already inserted. "I'm Lucy, and this is Thomas," her granddaughter announced, with the casual confidence of someone who had never met a stranger she couldn't befriend. "What's your name?" The man looked down at the children with wonder, as if he'd forgotten such creatures existed. When he spoke, his voice was rough from disuse, barely a whisper carried on the mountain wind. "Gabriel." Eleanor took a tentative step closer, her practical mind cataloguing everything wrong with this scene. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees in the last hour. She could see her breath misting in the air, yet Gabriel wore only a thin cotton shirt and torn jeans. His feet were bare, his skin somehow unmarked by the cold or the rough cemetery ground. And those eyes, they seemed ancient, holding depths that made her think of dark water and starless nights. "Are you hungry?" Thomas asked, breaking off half his granola bar. "Grandma always packs too much food. She thinks we're going to get lost in the wilderness or something." Gabriel accepted the offering with hands that trembled slightly. Eleanor noticed his palms then, raised marks across each one, like old scars that had healed strangely. When he bit into the granola bar, his eyes closed as if he were tasting food for the first time in years. "Where do you live?" Lucy pressed, her 8-year-old directness cutting through adult pretenses. "Do you have a house, a family?" "I've been traveling," Gabriel said carefully, "for a very long time." Eleanor's grandmother instincts warred with something else, a strange pull she couldn't name. Every rational part of her screamed to gather the children and leave. This was exactly the kind of situation parents warned about: strange men, isolated locations, children too trusting for their own good. But there was something about Gabriel's presence that felt safe wasn't the right word. Sacred, perhaps. Like standing in church when sunlight streamed through stained glass windows. "How long?" Thomas asked, always the more analytical of the twins. Gabriel's smile faltered, and for a moment his face showed such profound loneliness that Eleanor's chest tightened with unexpected sympathy. "Longer than you might believe." A gust of wind swept through the cemetery, rattling the bare branches of the old oak trees, but the roses around Gabriel remained perfectly still, their petals undisturbed. Eleanor noticed other details now. The grass beneath him was greener than anywhere else in the cemetery, and the weathered headstone at his back, her husband Richard's headstone, looked cleaner somehow, as if years of grime had been gently washed away. "Grandma's been sad too," Lucy said with the brutal honesty children wielded like surgical instruments. "Ever since Grandpa died. She tries to hide it, but we know." Heat flooded Eleanor's cheeks. "Lucy Marie—" "It's true," Thomas chimed in, completely oblivious to his grandmother's embarrassment. "She talks to his picture sometimes when she thinks we can't hear." Gabriel turned his attention to Eleanor then, and she felt suddenly exposed, as if he could see through all the careful walls she'd built around her grief. His dark eyes held understanding that made her throat tight. "Loss is difficult," he said simply. And somehow those 3 words contained more comfort than the dozens of well-meaning condolences she'd received over the past 3 years. The church bells of St. Mark's began to chime 5 o'clock, their bronze voices echoing off the mountain peaks. Eleanor realized with a start that they'd been here for over an hour, though it felt like minutes. The sun hung low above the pine trees, painting the cemetery in shades of amber and gold. "We should go," she said reluctantly. though every instinct told her not to leave this man alone among the graves. The children need supper, and it gets cold quickly once the sun sets. Gabriel nodded, rising fluidly to his feet. "Thank you," he said to the twins. "For the food, for the company. Will you be here tomorrow?" Lucy asked hopefully. "We could bring more sandwiches." Before Gabriel could answer, Eleanor found herself speaking. "There's a shelter in town, at the Methodist Church on Pine Street. They serve hot meals and—" "I'll be here," Gabriel said quietly, his eyes never leaving hers. "If that's acceptable." Something in his voice made it sound less like a statement and more like a question that would change everything. Eleanor felt the weight of Gabriel's question settling over her, like the mountain shadows now stretching across the cemetery. Acceptable. Such a simple word that somehow felt loaded with implications she couldn't yet fathom. She found herself nodding before her practical mind could intervene. "We'll see you tomorrow then," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. The walk home took them down the familiar gravel path that wound through the pines, past the old stone wall that marked the boundary between sacred ground and the ordinary world. With each step away from Gabriel, Eleanor felt the strange magic of the afternoon settling into memory, becoming something she could almost convince herself she'd imagined. Almost, but her knees still moved without pain, and when she glanced back one final time, she could see the crimson roses glowing like small fires in the gathering dusk. Their small blue cottage on Maple Street welcomed them with the comfortable disorder of a house where children spent their afternoons. Lucy's art supplies scattered across the kitchen table, Thomas's library books stacked in precise towers by the window seat, the lingering scent of morning coffee and Eleanor's lavender sachets. Home. This was what she had to protect. What she'd spent 3 years carefully reconstructing after Richard's death had threatened to tear apart everything that mattered. "Can we really take Gabriel more sandwiches tomorrow?" Lucy asked, already rummaging through the refrigerator, as if meal planning for mysterious strangers was perfectly normal. "We'll see," Eleanor replied, the default response that had served her through decades of teaching and grandmothering. But even as she said it, she was mentally inventorying her pantry, calculating what she could pack without drawing attention from the children's mother. Sarah. Eleanor's stomach clenched as she thought of her daughter-in-law, who would arrive Sunday evening to collect the twins after their week-long visit. Sarah, with her perfectly organized life and color-coded calendar, who still treated Eleanor with the careful politeness reserved for elderly relatives who might become burdensome at any moment. Sarah, who had made it quietly clear that these weekly visits were a trial period, a test of Eleanor's capability to care for Lucy and Thomas now that she was getting on. At 70, Eleanor was hardly decrepit, but she understood the subtext. One misstep, one indication that she wasn't up to the responsibility, and these precious weeks with her grandchildren would become monthly visits, then holiday-only appearances, then the kind of dutiful but distant relationship that broke grandmothers' hearts across America. She couldn't afford to be the woman who let her grandchildren befriend homeless strangers in cemeteries, no matter how inexplicably safe Gabriel felt. "Bath time," she announced, pushing the troubling thoughts aside. "School tomorrow." The evening routine unfolded with comforting predictability. Bubble baths and bedtime stories, Lucy's endless chatter about her best friend Madison's birthday party, Thomas's careful questions about whether fish dreams were different from people dreams. Eleanor tucked them into the twin beds she'd set up in Richard's old study, the room that still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco, despite 3 years of lavender sachets and open windows. "Grandma?" Lucy's voice was drowsy but persistent. "Gabriel seemed really sad, didn't he?" Eleanor smoothed the quilt, one she'd made during the long months of Richard's illness, when her hands had needed something to do besides worry. "Some people carry sadness for a long time, sweetheart. Like you do?" The question hit like a physical blow. Eleanor had thought she'd hidden her grief better, especially around the children. "I'm not sad when you're here," she said truthfully. "But when we're not here—" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, listening to Thomas's breathing deepen into sleep, to the wind moving through the pines outside their window. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But that's normal when someone you love goes away." "Gabriel looked like he lost everyone he ever loved," Lucy whispered. The observation was so astute, so unexpectedly mature, that Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "Maybe he has," she said softly. "Maybe that's why he needs kindness." But even as she spoke the words, Eleanor felt the familiar tension between her heart and her head. Her heart wanted to gather Gabriel up the way she'd once collected stray cats and wounded birds, to feed him and warm him and heal whatever had put such ancient sorrow in his eyes. Her head reminded her sharply that she was a 70-year-old woman with responsibilities, with grandchildren to protect, with a carefully rebuilt life that couldn't afford any more upheaval. After the children were asleep, Eleanor made herself a cup of chamomile tea and settled into Richard's old chair by the living room window. From here she could see the lights of town scattered across the valley below, each one representing a family, a life, a small universe of hopes and worries not so different from her own. Somewhere out there, Gabriel sat alone among the graves, and Eleanor found herself wondering if he was cold, if he was hungry, if anyone besides two 8-year-old children had shown him kindness in recent memory. She sipped her tea and tried not to think about tomorrow, about the choice she'd somehow already made. The phone rang at 6:47 a.m., piercing through Eleanor's restless sleep like a blade through silk. She'd been dreaming of roses and ancient eyes, of hands marked with impossible scars reaching for her across a field of weathered headstones. The shrill electronic sound dragged her back to her small bedroom, to the grey October dawn filtering through curtains she'd sewn 20 years ago. "Eleanor? This is Margaret Chen from the school." The principal's voice carried a forced cheerfulness that immediately set Eleanor's nerves on edge. "I hate to call so early, but we have a situation." Eleanor sat up, her heart hammering. Lucy and Thomas were still asleep down the hall. She could hear Thomas's soft snoring through the thin walls. "What kind of situation?" "Well, it seems your Lucy has been telling quite the story about meeting a homeless man in the cemetery yesterday. She's convinced her entire second-grade class that he made flowers bloom with his smile." Margaret's laugh was strained. Children and their imaginations, right? But some parents are concerned about the children being unsupervised around transients. The carefully neutral language couldn't mask the accusation underneath. Eleanor's grip tightened on the phone receiver, her knuckles white against the plastic. "The children were never unsupervised. I was with them the entire time." Of course. But Eleanor, you know how these things look, especially after... Well, there have been some complaints about your capability since Richard passed. Nothing official, you understand, but... What complaints? Eleanor's voice turned sharp, the same tone she'd once used to quell playground disputes and classroom disruptions. A pause. Too long. "It's not my place to say. But Eleanor, as your friend, I think you need to be very careful right now. Very careful about the choices you make regarding those children." The line went dead. Eleanor stared at the phone for a long moment, her mind racing through the implications. Someone had been watching. Someone had been questioning her fitness as a guardian. And now Lucy's innocent chatter about Gabriel had given them ammunition. She thought of Sarah's polite but distant demeanor, the way her daughter-in-law's eyes had lingered on the stack of unpaid bills on Eleanor's kitchen counter last week, the carefully casual questions about whether Eleanor felt overwhelmed by caring for the twins. The floorboards creaked in the hallway, followed by Lucy's voice calling out, "Grandma, is it time for school?" Eleanor forced brightness into her voice. "Almost, sweetheart. Get dressed and I'll make pancakes." But as she moved through the familiar morning routine, mixing batter, setting out plates, braiding Lucy's hair, her mind kept circling back to Margaret's warning. Very careful about the choices you make. As if kindness had become something dangerous, something that required strategic calculation rather than simple human decency. The children ate their pancakes with typical 8-year-old efficiency, Thomas methodically cutting his into perfect squares, while Lucy drizzled syrup in elaborate patterns. They chatted about their upcoming math test, about the Halloween decorations appearing around town, about everything except Gabriel. But Eleanor caught the meaningful glances they exchanged when they thought she wasn't looking. After dropping them at school, enduring the too bright smiles and slightly too long stares from other parents in the pickup line, Eleanor found herself driving not toward home, but toward the cemetery. She told herself she needed to see if Gabriel was still there, needed to assess the situation rationally in daylight. But truthfully, she needed to understand what had happened yesterday. She needed to know if the roses were still blooming, if her knee would still move without pain, if the strange sense of sacred presence had been real, or merely the product of an old woman's loneliness and imagination. St. Mark's Chapel stood silent in the morning light, its white clapboard walls and modest steeple a picture of small-town respectability. The cemetery stretched behind it, orderly rows of granite and marble marking lives lived and mourned and gradually forgotten. Eleanor walked the familiar path to Richard's grave, her steps slowing as she approached. Gabriel was there. He sat in exactly the same position as yesterday, his back against Richard's headstone, his face turned toward the rising sun. But in daylight, Eleanor could see details that had been hidden by afternoon shadows. His clothes, though worn, weren't dirty. His hair, though long and unkempt, was clean, and his skin, despite sleeping outdoors in October mountain air, showed no signs of exposure or hardship. The roses bloomed as vibrantly as they had yesterday, their crimson petals pristine despite the frost that had touched everything else in the cemetery. Gabriel turned at her approach, and when their eyes met, Eleanor felt the same inexplicable pull, the same sense that her ordinary world was about to be irrevocably changed. "You came back," he said simply. "I shouldn't have." The words escaped before she could stop them. People are asking questions, making assumptions. Gabriel nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his ancient eyes. "I could leave." "No." The response was immediate, instinctive, and Eleanor realized with crystalline clarity that she'd already made her choice. "Stay." But even as the word left her lips, Eleanor felt the full weight of what she'd just committed to. Her hands trembled as she sank onto the stone bench beside Richard's grave, the same bench where she'd sat through countless Sunday visits over the past 3 years, talking to granite and hoping somehow her words reached him. "I don't know why I said that," she whispered, more to herself than to Gabriel. "I can't. This isn't—" Gabriel remained silent, but his presence seemed to wrap around her like a warm shawl, steadying her racing heart. The morning sun caught the impossible roses, making them glow like stained glass, and Eleanor felt her resolve wavering between duty and something she couldn't name. "They're watching me," she said finally. "The school principal called this morning. Lucy told her class about you, about the flowers. Parents are talking." She laughed bitterly. Concerned parents, as if kindness to a stranger is some sort of criminal act. "Children see differently than adults," Gabriel said quietly. "They haven't learned yet that miracles are impossible." Eleanor's breath caught. The word hung between them, miracles, dangerous and beautiful and terrifying. She thought of her knee, still free from the arthritis that had plagued her for years. She thought of the roses blooming in October frost. She thought of the peace that had settled over her yesterday for the first time since Richard's funeral. "I can't lose them," she whispered. "Lucy and Thomas, they're all I have left. My daughter-in-law is just looking for an excuse to cut these visits short, to decide I'm too old, too irresponsible." Her voice cracked. "Too lonely to make good decisions." Gabriel turned then, his ancient eyes holding such compassion that Eleanor felt tears spill down her cheeks. "And what do you believe?" The simple question cut straight to the heart of her terror. What did she believe? That she was a foolish old woman, imagining magic where none existed, that grief had made her vulnerable to delusions, or that something sacred had entered her carefully controlled world, something that demanded she choose between safety and faith? "I believe I'm scared," she admitted. I've worked so hard to rebuild my life after Richard died, to prove I could still take care of myself, still be trusted with what matters most, and here I am, talking to a stranger in a cemetery about miracles, putting everything at risk for—" She gestured helplessly. "For what? I don't even know who you are." "Does it matter who I am?" Gabriel asked gently. "Or does it matter who you are?" Eleanor wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that reminded her sharply of Lucy when she was frustrated with a difficult math problem. "I'm a grandmother who's supposed to protect her grandchildren, not expose them to whatever this is. And what do you think this is?" The question forced her to examine the fear that had been clawing at her chest since Margaret's phone call. What was she really afraid of? That Gabriel might hurt the children? Every instinct she possessed said no. He radiated the same gentle safety she'd felt in church as a child when the world still seemed full of angels and answered prayers. That people would think she'd lost her mind? Perhaps. That she was risking custody of Lucy and Thomas for a fantasy? That was the heart of it. She was 70 years old, alone, except for 2 precious grandchildren who might be taken from her if she made one wrong move. She'd spent 3 years proving she could handle widowhood with dignity and competence, that she wasn't the stereotypical grieving widow who made poor decisions born of loneliness. But what if this wasn't a poor decision? What if it was the most important choice she'd ever make? "I keep thinking about what Lucy said," Eleanor murmured, "that you look like you've lost everyone you ever loved. And I wonder, how does an 8-year-old child recognize that kind of grief? How does she know to offer comfort to someone she just met?" Gabriel's smile was sad and beautiful, perhaps because she learned it from her grandmother. The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She thought of all the times Lucy had crawled into her lap during the dark months after Richard's death, small arms wrapping around her neck, whispering that everything would be okay. She thought of Thomas carefully making her tea when he found her crying over photo albums. They had learned compassion by watching her grieve, by seeing love continue even after its object was gone. "They're good children," she said softly. "Yes, and they have a good grandmother." Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the choice before her. Safety lay in walking away, in returning to her small blue cottage and her careful routine, in never speaking of mysterious strangers and impossible roses. But something deeper than safety was calling to her, something that felt like the answer to prayers she'd been afraid to pray. When she opened her eyes, Gabriel was watching her with infinite patience, as if he had all the time in the world to wait for her decision. The morning sun climbed higher, warming her face, and Eleanor felt the terrible, wonderful moment of surrender approaching like dawn after the longest night. "I'll help you," Eleanor said, the words falling from her lips like stones into still water, sending ripples through everything she'd carefully constructed since Richard's death. The moment she spoke them, she felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, a sensation like stepping off a cliff and discovering she could fly. Her hands stopped trembling. Her breathing steadied. The gnawing anxiety that had plagued her since Margaret's phone call transformed into something else entirely: purpose. Gabriel's expression didn't change, but the quality of his stillness deepened, as if he'd been holding his breath for centuries and could finally exhale. "You understand what this means?" Eleanor looked around the cemetery, at the orderly rows of granite markers bearing the names of people she'd known and taught and mourned. Her gaze settled on Richard's headstone, where impossible roses bloomed in defiance of October frost, and she realized that understanding had nothing to do with it. "No," she said honestly. "I don't understand anything about this. I don't understand who you are, or why flowers bloom when you smile, or why my arthritis disappeared when you touched my hand." She turned back to Gabriel, meeting his ancient eyes without flinching. "But I understand that Lucy and Thomas saw something in you that adults have forgotten how to see. And I understand that I've spent 3 years playing it safe, making careful choices, proving to everyone that I'm still capable and responsible and worthy of trust." She stood up from the stone bench, her movements fluid and painless. "I'm tired of being worthy. I'm tired of careful." Gabriel rose as well, and Eleanor was struck again by the contradictions he presented. Homeless yet clean, weathered yet ageless, sorrowful yet radiating an inexplicable peace that seemed to quiet every anxiety in her mind. "They'll come for you," he said gently. "The townspeople. They're already suspicious, and fear makes suspicion dangerous. You could lose everything you've worked to protect." Eleanor thought of Lucy's arms around her neck, of Thomas's careful tea ceremonies, of Sunday afternoons, reading stories in Richard's old chair while autumn light slanted through her living room windows. Everything precious, everything that gave her life meaning. Then she thought of Margaret's warning, of the careful distance in Sarah's eyes, of the way other parents had stared at her in the school pickup line. She'd been losing them anyway, bit by bit, day by day, as age and widowhood gradually eroded her place in their world. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe I'll finally stop living like a ghost in my own life." The words surprised her with their truth. When had she become so afraid? When had she started measuring every choice against the possibility of loss, every gesture against the risk of judgment? Somewhere between Richard's diagnosis and his funeral, between the concerned casseroles and the gentle suggestions that she consider something smaller, more manageable, she'd begun to shrink. To make herself smaller, quieter, less likely to cause concern or require assistance. But watching Gabriel yesterday, seeing the way Lucy and Thomas had responded to him with such immediate compassion, Eleanor remembered who she used to be, the teacher who'd opened her classroom to every lost child, the woman who'd brought home strays and fought for the underdog and never counted the cost of kindness. "What do you need?" she asked. Gabriel smiled, not the radiant expression that had made flowers bloom, but something quieter and infinitely grateful. "Food, shelter when the weather turns. But mostly," he paused, looking past her toward the town sprawling across the valley below, "mostly I need people to remember that love is stronger than fear." Eleanor followed his gaze, taking in the familiar landscape of her home for 7 decades. Cedar Falls in autumn was a postcard picture of small-town America, all golden aspens and smoke rising from chimneys, church spires and school buses, and the comfortable rhythms of ordinary life. But she understood suddenly that beneath its picturesque surface, her town was afraid, of change, of strangers, of anything that couldn't be easily categorized and controlled. "The children will want to see you again," she said. "I picked them up from school at 3:15. Gabriel nodded. "I'll be here." As Eleanor walked back toward her car, she felt as if she were moving through a different world than the one she'd entered that morning. The air seemed clearer, charged with possibility. Her steps were lighter, purposeful in a way they hadn't been since before Richard got sick. She thought of the phone calls that would come, the conversations she'd have to navigate, the bridges she might burn by choosing compassion over caution. For the first time in years, the prospect didn't terrify her. By the time she reached her cottage, Eleanor Hartwell had crossed a threshold she hadn't even known existed. There would be no going back to careful widowhood, to measured responses and calculated safety. She'd chosen mystery over certainty, faith over fear. She'd chosen to believe in miracles again. Eleanor had barely finished her morning coffee when the first test arrived, in the form of Father Martinez, standing on her front porch, his weathered face creased with concern. "Eleanor, may I come in?" His voice carried the careful neutrality he used for difficult pastoral visits, the tone she remembered from Richard's final days, when conversations became exercises in managing the unmanageable. She led him to her kitchen, noting how his eyes swept the familiar space as if cataloguing evidence. The breakfast dishes were washed and put away. The pill organizer on the counter was properly filled. The calendar by the refrigerator showed her neat handwriting, marking doctor appointments and school events. Everything a responsible grandmother should have. "Margaret Collins called me," he said without preamble. "She's concerned about a situation at the cemetery, something involving you and the children and a stranger." Eleanor poured him coffee from the pot that was still warm, buying herself time to think. Through the kitchen window she could see Mrs. Peterson from across the street trimming her hedge with unusual vigor. her attention clearly focused on Eleanor's front door. "I met someone who needed help," Eleanor said carefully. "I helped him." "A homeless man. In the cemetery where you take Lucy and Thomas." Father Martinez's tone remained neutral, but Eleanor caught the edge underneath. "Eleanor, I've known you for 40 years. You're one of the most sensible, caring people in this parish, but people are talking, and not kindly. They're saying grief has affected your judgment." The words hit their intended mark. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, the familiar burn of being patronized, dismissed as an emotional old woman whose decisions couldn't be trusted. "And what do you think, Father?" He hesitated, and in that pause, Eleanor saw the answer. Even Father Martinez, who'd baptized her grandchildren, who'd delivered Richard's eulogy, who'd known her since she was a young teacher, volunteering for every church committee, even he doubted her. "I think you have a good heart that sometimes overrules good sense," he said gently. "There are proper channels for helping the homeless. The church has a fund, connections with social services in Centennial. You don't need to put yourself or the children at risk by treating someone with basic human dignity." Eleanor set down her coffee cup with more force than necessary. "By letting my grandchildren learn that kindness matters more than fear. By exposing them to unknown dangers." Father Martinez leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Eleanor, you don't know this man. You don't know his history, his mental state, his intentions. And after what happened to the Kimmel family in Denver last month, this isn't Denver, and Gabriel isn't dangerous." "Gabriel?" The name seemed to surprise him. "He told you his name?" Something in his tone made Eleanor pause. "Yes. Why?" Father Martinez was quiet for a long moment, his fingers wrapped around his coffee mug. When he spoke again, his voice held a different quality, not pastoral concern, but something deeper. "There have been reports from other towns, other congregations, a man calling himself Gabriel, appearing in difficult times, performing what some people call miracles, always followed by controversy, division, people making claims that can't be verified." Eleanor's heart began to beat faster. What kind of claims? Healings, inexplicable events, people saying their lives were transformed by meeting him. Father Martinez met her eyes directly. And then he disappears, leaving communities torn between believers and skeptics, families divided, churches split. Whatever good he might do gets overshadowed by the chaos he leaves behind. Before Eleanor could respond, she heard familiar voices in the driveway, car doors slamming, footsteps on gravel. Through the window, she saw Sarah climbing out of her silver sedan, her face set in the expression Eleanor recognized as trouble. Behind her, David emerged more slowly, his shoulders already set in the defensive posture he'd inherited from his father. "I should go," Father Martinez said, standing quickly, but it was too late. Sarah was already knocking, the sharp rap of knuckles that brooked no delay. Eleanor opened the door to find her daughter-in-law's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes bright with the particular anger of someone who'd spent the drive working herself into righteous indignation. "We need to talk," Sarah announced, brushing past Eleanor into the house. "About your fitness to watch the children." David followed, offering Eleanor an apologetic shrug that somehow made everything worse. "Hi, Mom. Sarah got some calls this morning. She's concerned." "Hello, Father." Sarah nodded curtly to Martinez, then turned back to Eleanor. "I suppose you know why we're here." Eleanor found herself caught between the priest who thought she was a well-meaning fool and the daughter-in-law who'd been looking for reasons to limit her time with Lucy and Thomas since Richard died. The walls of her small kitchen seemed to close in, the familiar space suddenly feeling like a courtroom where she stood accused of crimes she couldn't name. But then she remembered Gabriel's question from that morning, "Does it matter who I am, or does it matter who you are?" She straightened her shoulders, meeting Sarah's challenging stare with the same steady gaze she'd once used to face down difficult parents and hostile school board meetings. "Yes," Eleanor said quietly. "I know exactly why you're here. The question is whether you'll listen to what I have to say." The silence that followed Eleanor's words stretched taut as a wire, filled with the weight of relationships hanging in the balance. Sarah's perfectly manicured fingers drummed against her purse strap, a nervous habit she'd developed since becoming a mother, though she'd never admit to being nervous about anything. "I'm listening," Sarah said, but her tone suggested she'd already reached her conclusions during the 20-minute drive from town. "Though I have to say, Eleanor, what I've heard is deeply concerning." Father Martinez shifted uncomfortably by the coffee pot, caught between his pastoral duty and his obvious desire to escape what was clearly becoming a family confrontation. David stood behind his wife like a reluctant bodyguard, his eyes apologetic, but his silence speaking volumes about where his loyalties lay. Eleanor gestured toward the kitchen table, the same oak surface where she'd helped Lucy with homework just yesterday, where Thomas had carefully arranged his action figures while she made them lunch. "Please, sit, all of you." As they settled into chairs that suddenly felt too small for the magnitude of what was happening, Eleanor found herself cataloguing details with the precision of someone who understood she was fighting for her life. Sarah's designer handbag, chosen to project success and competence. David's nervous habit of pushing his glasses up his nose, inherited from his father. Father Martinez's wedding ring, worn thin from 40 years of marriage, a reminder that love could endure, could weather storms. "Margaret Collins saw you yesterday," Sarah began without preamble, "with Lucy and Thomas, talking to some homeless man in the cemetery. She said the children were interacting with him, sharing food." "Yes," Eleanor said simply. "They were being kind." "Kind?" Sarah's voice rose an octave. "Eleanor, he could have been anyone, a drug addict, a pedophile, someone with serious mental illness. You exposed my children to a complete stranger without any thought to their safety." The words "my children" hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Not the children, or Lucy and Thomas, but my children. A linguistic claim that drew battle lines as clearly as any declaration of war. Eleanor understood with sudden clarity that this confrontation had been inevitable since the day Richard died, maybe even before that. Sarah had been waiting for proof that Eleanor was too old, too foolish, too compromised by grief to be trusted with what mattered most. "I was with them every moment," Eleanor said, keeping her voice level. "They were never in danger." "You don't know that." David spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of parental fear that Eleanor remembered from when he was small, when every scraped knee was a crisis and every fever a potential catastrophe. "Mum, you can't know that about a stranger." Father Martinez cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should focus on moving forward. Eleanor understands the concern, and I'm sure she'll exercise better judgment." "Will she?" Sarah interrupted. "Because from what I understand, this isn't a one-time lapse in judgment. She's planning to—" "What? Continue this relationship? Bring the children back to visit this man?" Eleanor felt the trap closing around her. Every answer she could give would damn her further in Sarah's eyes. Denial would be a lie, and Sarah would see through it immediately. Honesty would confirm her worst fears. But as she looked around the table at these three people, all of whom claimed to care about her welfare, Eleanor realized she was tired of being managed, tired of having her choices weighed and measured by others, her autonomy slowly eroded by their concern for her best interests. "His name is Gabriel," she said quietly. "And yes, I intend to help him." The admission fell into silence like a stone into still water. Sarah's face went pale, then flushed with anger. David removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes with the gesture of a man who'd just watched his mother step off a cliff. "Then we have a problem," Sarah said, her voice deadly calm. "Because I will not allow my children to be put at risk because their grandmother has decided to play Good Samaritan with dangerous strangers." "Sarah," David began, but his wife cut him off with a look. "No, this is non-negotiable. Either Eleanor agrees to stay away from this man and exercises appropriate judgment when she has the children, or the visits stop. Completely." The ultimatum hung in the air between them, brutal in its simplicity. Eleanor felt her carefully rebuilt world cracking along fault lines she'd pretended didn't exist. Father Martinez studied his coffee cup as if it held the secrets of the universe. David looked like he might be sick. But Eleanor found herself thinking of Gabriel's ancient eyes, of Lucy's immediate compassion, of Thomas's earnest desire to help someone who was hurting. She thought of the woman she used to be, before grief and age had taught her to choose safety over conviction. "I understand," Eleanor said finally, and saw relief flood Sarah's face. Then she delivered the words that would change everything, "But my answer is no." The silence that followed Eleanor's refusal was so complete it seemed to stop time itself. Sarah's face cycled through disbelief, shock, and finally a cold fury that transformed her features into something Eleanor barely recognized. David's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air. Father Martinez set down his coffee cup with trembling hands. "No?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the force of an avalanche. "Did you just tell me no?" Eleanor met her daughter-in-law's stare without flinching, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. 3 years. 3 years of careful behavior, of proving she was still capable, still worthy of trust. 3 years of swallowing her opinions, moderating her choices, accepting their gentle management of her life. All of it about to be swept away by 2 small words. "I did." Sarah stood so abruptly her chair scraped against the floor. "Then you've lost your mind. Completely lost your mind." She turned to David, her voice rising to a pitch that made Eleanor wince. "Did you hear her? She's choosing some homeless stranger over her own grandchildren." "Mom." David's voice cracked like a teenager's. "Mom, please. Think about what you're saying. Think about Lucy and Thomas." "I am thinking about them." Eleanor rose as well, surprised by the steadiness in her legs, the clarity in her voice. "I'm thinking about what kind of woman I want to be in their lives, what kind of example I want to set. The example of reckless endangerment?" Sarah's composure was fracturing, revealing the terror underneath. "The example of choosing strangers over family?" Father Martinez tried to interject. "Perhaps if we all take a moment to—" "No," Sarah whirled on him. "There's nothing to discuss. This is exactly what we were afraid of. The grief, the isolation, the gradual decline in judgment. She needs help, professional help, not enablers making excuses for dangerous behavior." The words hit Eleanor like physical blows. Grief, isolation, decline, each label another bar in the cage they were building around her, another reason to strip away her autonomy. She thought of Richard's final months, how the doctors had spoken around him, about him, as if his illness had already erased his personhood. She'd sworn she'd never let that happen to her. "David." Eleanor turned to her son, searching his face for any sign of the boy who used to defend wounded animals, who'd cried when other children were cruel. "Do you remember when you were 8, when you brought home that injured bird?" He blinked, confused by the apparent non sequitur. "Mom, what does that have to—" I could have said no. It was messy, risky. The bird might have had diseases, might have bitten you, might have died despite our care. But you saw something suffering, and you couldn't walk away. Eleanor's voice grew stronger with each word. "That's who you were. That's who I raised you to be." David's face crumpled. "This is different. This is about Lucy and Thomas's safety. This is about whether we teach them to see suffering and turn away, or to respond with compassion." Eleanor looked between them all, son, daughter-in-law, priest, and saw the fear in their eyes, fear of risk, of judgment, of anything that couldn't be controlled and managed. Gabriel isn't dangerous, he's lost and hurting, and the children recognized that immediately. They didn't see a threat, they saw someone who needed help. "Children don't understand danger," Sarah snapped. "That's why they need adults to protect them from their own naive impulses. Or maybe," Eleanor said quietly, "children understand love better than adults who've spent years learning to be afraid." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah's face went white, then red, cycling through emotions too quickly to track. When she spoke again, her voice was ice-cold and absolutely certain. "Fine. You've made your choice." She turned to David. "Get your keys. We're going to pick up Lucy and Thomas from school, and then we're going home, to Denver, today." "Sarah, wait." David reached for his wife's arm, but she shook him off. "No waiting, no discussion. She just told us she values a stranger's welfare over our children's safety. There's nothing left to discuss." Sarah's gaze fixed on Eleanor with laser precision. "You won't see them again until you get the help you obviously need and can demonstrate that you're capable of making rational decisions." The threat landed like a physical blow. Eleanor felt her knees buckle, caught herself against the table. Lucy and Thomas, their sticky hugs and earnest questions, and absolute faith that Grandma Eleanor could fix anything. The thought of losing them, of them wondering why she disappeared from their lives, nearly brought her to her knees. But then she thought of Gabriel's ancient eyes, of the way flowers had bloomed at his touch, of the miracle of her own pain-free hands. Some things were worth the risk. Some things demanded courage, even when courage felt like stepping off a cliff. "I understand," Eleanor whispered. Sarah nodded sharply, vindicated. Then Eleanor straightened her spine and delivered the words that would seal her fate. "But I won't change my mind." Sarah's face transformed into something Eleanor had never seen before. Not anger now, but something colder, more final. The look of someone cutting losses, severing ties, walking away from a relationship that had become too costly to maintain. "Then you'll do it alone," Sarah said, her voice stripped of all emotion. "David, we're leaving." Now, David stood frozen between them, his face pale with the agony of choosing sides. "Sarah, maybe we should—" "Now, David." Sarah's tone brooked no argument. "Get your keys. We have 40 minutes before school lets out." Eleanor watched her son, her gentle, thoughtful son who'd spent his whole life trying to keep peace, crumble under the weight of an impossible choice. When he reached into his pocket for his car keys, the small metallic jingle sounded like the closing of a door. "I'm sorry, Mom," David whispered, not meeting her eyes. "I can't risk their safety. You have to understand that." Eleanor understood perfectly. She also understood that she was watching her family disintegrate in real time, watching everything that had given her life meaning since Richard's death slipped through her fingers like water. Father Martinez stood abruptly, his coffee growing cold and forgotten. "This has gone far enough. Eleanor, be reasonable. Is this stranger really worth losing your grandchildren?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Eleanor looked around her kitchen, at the drawings Lucy had made stuck to her refrigerator, at Thomas's forgotten toy soldier on the windowsill, at the empty chairs where they'd sat just yesterday, faces bright with excitement about their adventure. This room had been the center of her rebuilt universe, the place where she'd learned to laugh again, to hope again, to believe she still had something valuable to offer the world. Now it felt like a mausoleum. "I need to know something," Eleanor said quietly. "If I change my mind right now, if I promise never to see Gabriel again, never to mention him to the children, will that be enough? Or will there be other tests, other ultimatums? Other times when I have to prove my worthiness to be part of their lives?" Sarah's silence was answer enough. "That's what I thought." Eleanor sank into her chair, suddenly feeling every one of her 67 years. "This isn't really about Gabriel, is it? This is about control, about managing the inconvenient old woman who might embarrass you or make choices you don't approve of." "That's not fair," David protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" Eleanor looked at him with infinite sadness. "When was the last time I made a decision about my own life without running it past you first? When did I stop being your mother and become your responsibility?" The questions hit their mark. David flinched, recognition dawning in his eyes. But Sarah stepped forward, her resolve unshaken. "The difference is that your decisions now affect our children, our family, and I will not apologize for putting their welfare first." Through the window, Eleanor could see her neighbors' houses, each one containing families living their careful, calculated lives. Safe lives, predictable lives. lives where miracles were suspect and strangers were threats, and love came with conditions and expiration dates. She thought of Gabriel sitting among the headstones, carrying whatever impossible burden had carved such sorrow into his features. She thought of the way Lucy had approached him without fear, the way Thomas had shared his sandwich without hesitation. Children who still believed the world could be healed with kindness. Now they would learn different lessons. They would learn that love was conditional, that helping others was dangerous, that sometimes you had to choose between safety and compassion. They would grow up careful and afraid, measuring every gesture of kindness against its potential cost. "Please," Eleanor whispered, the word torn from somewhere deep in her chest. "They're all I have left." Sarah's expression softened slightly, perhaps recognizing the genuine anguish in Eleanor's voice. For a moment, hope flickered in Eleanor's heart. Then Sarah shook her head. "You had a choice. You made it." The finality in those words broke something inside Eleanor. She watched David gather himself, watched him choose his wife over his mother, watched 43 years of love and shared history crumble under the weight of fear. "Tell them," Eleanor started, then stopped. What could she say? That she loved them? That she was sorry? That sometimes doing the right thing meant losing everything you treasured? "Tell them Grandma will miss them," she finished quietly. Father Martinez cleared his throat. "Eleanor, it's not too late. You could still—" "Yes, it is," Eleanor said, understanding finally flooding through her. "It's been too late for a long time. I just didn't want to see it." David and Sarah left without looking back, their footsteps echoing across the porch and down the gravel drive. Eleanor sat in her suddenly empty kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of a life that had just ended, listening to the sound of their car disappearing down the mountain road. She was alone, completely, utterly alone. And somewhere in the cemetery, Gabriel waited among the dead, carrying secrets that might cost her everything she had left. Eleanor remained in her kitchen long after the sound of David's car faded into the mountain silence. The coffee had grown cold, the afternoon light had shifted, and still she sat motionless, staring at the empty chairs where her family had delivered their verdict. The drawings on her refrigerator, Lucy's crayon flowers, Thomas's stick-figure family, seemed to mock her now, relics of a happiness that had been more fragile than she'd understood. When she finally moved, it was with the mechanical precision of someone in shock. She cleared the coffee cups, wiped the table, straightened chairs that didn't need straightening, anything to avoid the silence that pressed against her eardrums like deep water. But eventually there was nothing left to clean, nothing left to organize, and the truth settled over her like a shroud. She had gambled everything on a stranger in a cemetery and lost. The rational part of her mind, the part that sounded like David's worried voice, whispered that it wasn't too late. She could call them, apologize, promise to be more careful, more sensible, trade her autonomy for their approval, her convictions for their presence. She'd done it before, these past 3 years, bending herself into whatever shape they needed her to be. But even as the thought formed, she knew she wouldn't make that call, couldn't make it. Because somewhere between Gabriel's ancient eyes and Lucy's fearless compassion, Eleanor had remembered who she used to be. The woman who'd stood up to school boards when funding was threatened, who'd tutored children other teachers had given up on, who'd sat with Richard through his final illness and held his hand while he died, choosing love over the easier path of letting others manage his care. That woman wouldn't have hesitated to help a suffering stranger. That woman wouldn't have needed permission to follow her conscience. When had she become so afraid? When had she started measuring every choice against other people's comfort? The questions followed her as she walked through her too-quiet house, past Richard's study, where his books still lined the shelves, past the guest room where Lucy and Thomas had slept just last weekend, their whispered conversations carrying through the walls like music. She paused at the window that overlooked the cemetery, where the late afternoon sun slanted through the trees, casting long shadows among the weathered headstones. Gabriel was there. She could see his silhouette near the old oak, motionless as the stones around him, waiting, as he'd been waiting when the children found him, as he'd probably been waiting long before that. Eleanor pressed her palm against the cool glass and felt something shift inside her chest. Not breaking this time, but settling into place. A decision crystallizing like ice forming on winter glass. She'd lost her family today, lost the center of her carefully reconstructed world, but she'd also lost something else, the illusion that love without courage was love at all, that safety could be purchased with compromise, that a life lived in fear of making mistakes was a life worth living. Richard's voice seemed to whisper from the shadows of her memory. What would you tell one of your students, Ellie, if they came to you afraid of doing the right thing because someone might disapprove? She would have told them that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was acting in spite of fear, that sometimes standing up meant standing alone, that the measure of a life wasn't in its safety, but in its service to something larger than itself. Eleanor turned away from the window and walked to her bedroom, where she pulled Richard's old jacket from the closet. It still smelled faintly of his cologne, still held the shape of his shoulders. She'd kept it for comfort, but now she pulled it on for armor. In the kitchen, she gathered what remained of her groceries: bread, cheese, apples, a thermos of soup she'd made yesterday, when the future still included Sunday dinners with her grandchildren. She packed everything in a basket, her movements steady now, purposeful. At the door, she paused. Stepping outside meant accepting the choice she'd made and all its consequences. It meant choosing mystery over security, faith over certainty. It meant walking toward a man who might be exactly what he appeared, a broken stranger in need of help, or something far more impossible. But as Eleanor thought of the flowers blooming at Gabriel's touch, of her arthritis melting away under his gaze, of the peace that had settled over the cemetery when he smiled, she realized the choice had been made long before today. Made the moment Lucy had taken Gabriel's hand without fear. Made when Thomas had shared his sandwich with a stranger. Made when she'd watched two children demonstrate the kind of love that adults had forgotten how to give. Eleanor Hartwell stepped out into the autumn afternoon, closing the door behind her on the safe, small life she'd been trying so desperately to preserve. Ahead lay the cemetery, the setting sun, and a man whose true identity might shatter everything she thought she knew about the world. But for the first time in 3 years, she felt completely, utterly alive. The autumn air cut through Richard's jacket like a blessing, sharp and clean and real. Eleanor's footsteps crunched through fallen leaves as she made her way toward the cemetery, the basket's weight solid against her arm. Each step felt deliberate, purposeful, the walk of someone who had finally stopped running from her own convictions. The cemetery gate stood open, its iron hinges creaking softly in the mountain breeze. Eleanor paused at the threshold, not from hesitation but from a sudden awareness of the moment's significance. She was crossing more than just a boundary between the world of the living and the resting place of the dead. She was stepping into whatever came after safety, after the careful calculations that had governed her life since Richard's passing. Gabriel sat exactly where she'd expected to find him, beneath the old oak where shadows pooled like dark water. His stillness was absolute, as if he'd grown from the earth itself, another monument to loss and time. But when she approached, his head lifted, and those ancient eyes fixed on her with something that might have been surprise. "I brought food," Eleanor said, settling onto the grass beside him with more grace than she'd felt in years. The dampness soaked through her clothes, but her joints remained free of their familiar ache. "I thought you might be hungry." Gabriel studied her for a long moment, his gaze seeming to take in not just her presence, but the weight of what it cost her to be there. "Your family," he said finally, his voice rough from disuse. "They didn't approve." It wasn't a question. Eleanor unpacked the basket, laying out bread and cheese and apples, with the same care she'd once used arranging her classroom for the first day of school. "No, they didn't. They took the children home to Denver. I may not see them again for a very long time." She waited for the words to break her, for the full impact of her loss to drive her to her knees. Instead, she felt only a deep, settled certainty. The grief was there, would always be there, but it sat beside something stronger, the knowledge that she'd chosen truth over comfort, courage over safety. "I'm sorry," Gabriel said, and the simple words carried depths of understanding that made Eleanor's throat tighten. "Are you?" She met his gaze directly. "Because I think this is what you do, isn't it? You appear in people's lives and force them to choose who they really are." Gabriel's mouth curved in what might have been a smile, though it carried too much sadness to be called one. "People make their own choices. I simply exist, and the world responds accordingly." Eleanor unwrapped the cheese, cut thick slices with Richard's old pocket knife. "The town is talking. About you. About the things they've seen. Dr. Chen's wife called her sister in Pueblo, told her about your hands, about what happened when you touched them. By tomorrow, half the county will know something unusual is happening in Cedar Falls. And that frightens you." "It should," Eleanor admitted, passing him bread and cheese. "A reasonable person would be terrified of the attention, the questions, the scrutiny. But I find myself wondering if being reasonable has cost me more than it's protected me." They ate in companionable silence as the sun sank lower, painting the headstones in shades of gold and amber. Eleanor found herself studying Gabriel's profile, noting details that seemed to shift in the changing light. The lines around his eyes that spoke of countless sorrows, the way his hands moved with infinite gentleness, as if he were afraid of breaking the world with his touch. The sense of vastness contained within human form, like an ocean hidden inside a teacup. "The children saw you first," Eleanor said eventually. "Lucy and Thomas. They weren't afraid at all. Children rarely are. They haven't learned yet that mystery is dangerous, that different means threatening." Gabriel's voice carried the weight of centuries. "They love without condition, trust without calculation. They still remember what adults have forgotten." "What's that?" Gabriel turned to face her fully, and Eleanor felt her breath catch at the depth of compassion in his eyes. "That every stranger is a story waiting to be heard. Every act of kindness ripples outward in ways we can't imagine. Every choice to love instead of fear changes the world, even if only by degrees." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, not of sadness, but of recognition. "I was a teacher for 43 years. I used to know that. I used to live that." "You still do," Gabriel said quietly. "You're here." The simple statement hit her like revelation. She was here, despite the cost, despite the fear, despite losing everything that had anchored her rebuilt life. She'd chosen to sit with a stranger in a cemetery, to offer food and company in the radical gift of belief in something larger than her own understanding. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked. Gabriel's smile this time was real, transforming his face from ancient sorrow to something that might have been hope. "Now we discover what courage looks like when it stops hiding behind excuses. Now we find out who your allies really are. And now we prepare for what's coming, which is the world's chance to choose between fear and wonder," Gabriel said, reaching for an apple. "The question is whether it's ready." As the last light faded from the cemetery, Eleanor felt the weight of Gabriel's words settling into her bones. The world's chance to choose between fear and wonder. She understood now that her own choice had been only the beginning, a single note in a symphony that was about to crescendo into something that would demand an answer from everyone in Cedar Falls. "Then we'd better make sure it is ready," Eleanor said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "Because I'm not backing down. Not anymore." Gabriel's eyes widened slightly, as if he hadn't expected this fierce commitment from the woman who'd sat in her kitchen hours earlier, weeping over lost grandchildren. But Eleanor felt something fundamental shifting inside her chest, the last vestiges of the careful, frightened person she'd become burning away like fog before sunrise. "They'll come for you," she continued, packing away the remains of their meal with crisp efficiency. "The town council, the sheriff, maybe reporters when word spreads beyond the county. They'll want explanations, proof, evidence that fits into their understanding of how the world works." "Yes," Gabriel agreed simply. "And when they don't get those explanations, they'll try to drive you away, or worse." Eleanor's teacher instincts, dormant for 3 years, suddenly blazed to life. She began mentally cataloguing resources, allies, strategies. "But you're not going to make it easy for them to corner you out here alone." Gabriel tilted his head, studying her with those impossibly deep eyes. "What are you proposing?" "You're coming home with me." The words left her mouth before she'd fully formed the thought, but once spoken they felt absolutely right. "They want to treat you like some dangerous vagrant hiding in shadows? Fine. Let's see how brave they are when they have to face you in a living room, drinking tea from china cups." A laugh escaped Gabriel. Actual laughter, rich and warm and completely human. The sound seemed to ripple outward, and Eleanor could have sworn she heard an echo of response from somewhere beyond the cemetery walls, as if the mountain itself was pleased. "Eleanor Hartwell," Gabriel said, shaking his head in apparent amazement. "Do you have any idea what you're inviting into your home?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Eleanor thought of the miracles she'd witnessed, the impossible things that happened when Gabriel smiled or touched or simply existed in proximity to suffering. She thought of the town's growing suspicion, the phone calls that would come, the visitors who would arrive asking questions she couldn't answer. She thought of David's horrified face, of Sarah's ultimatum, of Lucy and Thomas learning that their grandmother had chosen a stranger over their safety. "I know exactly what I'm inviting," Eleanor said firmly. "The chance to do something that matters, the opportunity to stand for something bigger than my own comfort, the possibility that an old woman who's spent 3 years trying to become invisible might actually help change the world." Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from Eleanor's determined face to the darkening sky above. When he spoke, his voice carried a gravity that made her shiver. "Once we cross this threshold, there's no going back. Your quiet life, your hope of reconciling with your family, your standing in this community, all of it will be at risk. They won't just question me, Eleanor. They'll question you, your judgment, your sanity, your right to make your own choices. Let them." Eleanor stood, brushing grass from Richard's jacket with sharp, decisive movements. "I've spent 3 years proving I could be the grandmother they wanted, the neighbor they approved of, the kind of woman who never caused problems or asked uncomfortable questions. And what did it get me? A life so small and careful that losing it barely makes a sound." She turned to face Gabriel fully, her chin lifted in defiance of every voice that whispered she should be sensible, should be afraid, should retreat to safety before it was too late. But this, sitting in a cemetery with someone who makes flowers bloom and arthritis disappear, choosing mystery over certainty, faith over proof, this feels like the most important thing I've done since Richard died. Maybe since I stopped teaching, maybe ever. Gabriel rose to stand beside her, and in the moonlight, Eleanor caught a glimpse of something in his expression that took her breath away. Pride, perhaps, or recognition, or something even deeper. The look of someone who had been waiting a very long time for another person to choose courage over comfort. "Then let's go home," he said quietly. As they walked through the cemetery gate together, Eleanor felt the last of her old life falling away behind them like a discarded coat. Ahead lay her house, soon to become a sanctuary or a battleground, or perhaps both. Behind them, the peaceful dead bore witness to their departure, and somewhere in the distance, Cedar Falls slept unaware that everything was about to change. The final confrontation was coming, and Eleanor Hartwell, retired teacher and reluctant revolutionary, was ready. The walk from cemetery to house took less than 5 minutes, but Eleanor felt as though they were crossing continents. Each step carried the weight of irrevocable decision, and by the time they reached her front porch, she understood that the woman who had left this house hours ago no longer existed. In her place stood someone she barely recognized, someone who had chosen the impossible over the inevitable. "Wait," she said, her hand on the door handle. Gabriel paused beside her, patient as stone. "Before we go in, I need to know, are you dangerous?" The question surprised her even as she asked it, not because she feared the answer, but because she realized it was the wrong question entirely. Gabriel's presence was dangerous the way truth was dangerous, the way love was dangerous when it demanded everything and offered no guarantee of return. "Yes," Gabriel said simply. To lies, to cruelty, to the comfortable assumptions that allow suffering to flourish in shadows, to the kind of faith that requires no courage and costs nothing. He met her eyes. Are you prepared for that kind of danger, Eleanor? She turned the key and pushed open the door. I invited it home for dinner, didn't I? The house welcomed them with warm light and the lingering scent of this morning's coffee, evidence of the ordinary world that still existed somehow alongside miracles. Eleanor hung Richard's jacket in the closet, her movements automatic, while Gabriel stood quietly in the entryway, taking in the careful arrangement of a life built on memory and routine. It's beautiful, he said, and Eleanor followed his gaze to the photographs lining the hallway. Richard in his uniform, her classroom on the last day of school, Lucy and Thomas building a snowman last winter, their faces bright with joy. It's small, Eleanor corrected. I made it small on purpose. Small is safe. Small doesn't attract attention or ask difficult questions or force impossible choices. She gestured toward the kitchen. Tea? But as she moved to fill the kettle, Eleanor felt something shift in the air around them. Gabriel had stopped before a particular photograph, one she'd almost removed a dozen times since David's ultimatum. Lucy and Thomas at the cemetery just 1 week ago, grinning as they placed wildflowers on Richard's grave. In the background, barely visible among the headstones, was the shadow of a man sitting alone beneath an oak tree. They found me before they knew they were looking, Gabriel murmured. Eleanor's hand stilled on the kettle. You were waiting for them. I was waiting for someone brave enough to see past fear. Sometimes that's children. Sometimes it's teachers who remember what they were called to do. Gabriel's fingers traced the air near the photograph without quite touching it. Sometimes it's grandmothers who choose love over safety, even when love costs everything. The kettle began to whistle, but Eleanor didn't move to answer it. She was staring at Gabriel's reflection in the dark kitchen window, except it wasn't quite Gabriel anymore. For just a moment she could have sworn she saw someone else looking back, someone whose face carried the weight of every kindness and cruelty the world had ever witnessed, someone whose eyes held depths that made her think of stars being born and dying in distant galaxies. The tea, Gabriel said gently, and Eleanor startled back to herself, turning off the burner with shaking hands. As she prepared the cups, her grandmother's china, saved for occasions that never seemed quite special enough, Eleanor felt the first tremor of what was coming. Tomorrow, Dr. Chen would make more phone calls. Sheriff Martinez would receive reports of a vagrant staying illegally in someone's home. The town council would convene emergency meetings about public safety and proper procedures. And through it all, Gabriel would sit at her kitchen table, drinking tea from delicate porcelain, forcing everyone who entered to confront the possibility that their understanding of the world was catastrophically incomplete. They'll try to separate us, Eleanor said, setting the cups on the table. Make me seem like a lonely old woman who's lost her judgment. Make you seem like a predator taking advantage of grief and isolation. Gabriel accepted his tea with hands that bore scars she was finally allowing herself to see clearly. And how will you respond? Eleanor sat across from him, her spine straight, her voice steady. By making them look, by refusing to let them dismiss either of us without witnessing who we actually are, by remembering that I've faced down bureaucrats and bullies before and I'm still here. Gabriel's smile was radiant. Then let them come. Outside, Cedar Falls slept its last peaceful sleep. Inside, a retired teacher and a mysterious stranger sat drinking tea by lamplight, preparing for a confrontation that would force an entire community to choose between the safety of disbelief and the terrifying possibility that wonder still walked among them. Eleanor had never felt more awake in her life. Dawn came with the sound of car doors slamming and boots on gravel. Eleanor woke to voices outside her window, official voices, the kind that spoke in careful, measured tones while delivering ultimatums. She'd been expecting this, had even set her alarm for sunrise, but her heart still hammered against her ribs as she pulled on Richard's jacket and went to meet whatever was coming. Gabriel stood at the kitchen window, fully dressed, watching the small crowd that had gathered in her front yard. Sheriff Martinez, Dr. Chen, Mayor Whitman, 3 members of the town council she recognized but couldn't name, and behind them, keeping what they probably thought was a safe distance, perhaps a dozen residents of Cedar Falls who had come to witness whatever was about to unfold. "It's quite a welcoming committee," Gabriel said without turning around. Eleanor moved to stand beside him, taking in the scene with a teacher's eye for group dynamics. Fear made people gather in clusters, she'd learned. Courage made them stand alone. Every person outside her house had chosen their position carefully, close enough to be part of whatever happened, far enough back to claim innocence if it all went wrong. "They're afraid," she said. "Yes, but not of me." Gabriel's voice carried that strange quality that seemed to resonate in her bones. "They're afraid of what believing in me would require of them." A sharp knock echoed from the front door, 3 authoritative raps that demanded immediate attention. Eleanor straightened her shoulders, smoothed down her silver hair, and walked through her house like a woman heading to her own execution. When she opened the door, Sheriff Martinez's carefully neutral expression couldn't quite hide his relief that she appeared unharmed. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "we need to have a conversation." "Good morning to you too, Sheriff," Eleanor replied pleasantly. "Would you like some coffee? I've got fresh made." The offer clearly wasn't what he'd expected. Behind him, she could see Dr. Chen whispering urgently to the mayor, their words lost in the crisp morning air, but their agitation unmistakable. Several phones were pointed in her direction, recording devices held by people who thought they were witnessing a rescue operation. "Ma'am, we've received reports that you've got someone staying here who might pose a danger to the community," Sheriff Martinez continued, his voice carrying the forced patience of someone following a script. "We need to conduct a welfare check. Make sure you're all right." "I'm perfectly fine, thank you." Eleanor stepped aside, gesturing toward her kitchen. "But if you'd like to meet my guest and judge for yourself, he's having breakfast. Fair warning, though, he's not what you're expecting." Sheriff Martinez exchanged glances with Dr. Chen, and Eleanor caught the moment when official procedure collided with human curiosity. Whatever they'd been told about Gabriel, whatever fears had driven them to her doorstep at dawn, none of it had prepared them for a polite invitation to breakfast. "Mrs. Hartwell." Dr. Chen stepped forward, her medical training evident in the way she studied Eleanor's posture, her color, her alertness. "Your son called me yesterday. He's concerned about your judgment, about someone taking advantage of your grief. We just want to make sure that I haven't lost my mind." Eleanor's voice carried 43 years of dealing with concerned administrators and overprotective parents. "I appreciate the concern, truly. But I'm 67 years old, I own this house free and clear, and I'm legally entitled to invite anyone I choose to share my breakfast table." The crowd behind them stirred uneasily. Eleanor could feel their expectations shifting, their narrative of helpless victim and dangerous predator crumbling in the face of her calm defiance. But she also sensed their hunger for spectacle, their need for something extraordinary to justify their presence here. "Then you won't mind if we meet him," Mayor Whitman said, stepping up to flank Sheriff Martinez, "just to put everyone's minds at ease." Eleanor smiled, the same smile she'd used on particularly challenging school board meetings, the one that suggested she was perfectly happy to let people make fools of themselves if they insisted. "Not at all. But I do mind the circus." She gestured toward the crowd, the phones, the barely contained energy of people hoping for drama. "This is my home, not a public theater. Sheriff Martinez, you may come in. Dr. Chen, if you're here in a medical capacity, you're welcome too. The rest of you can wait outside until we're finished." The dismissal was absolute, delivered with the authority of someone who had spent decades managing unruly groups. Several people started to protest, but Eleanor had already turned her attention back to the 2 officials she'd invited inside. "Coming?" she asked pleasantly. Sheriff Martinez stepped across her threshold first, his hand resting unconsciously on his radio. Dr. Chen followed more hesitantly, her medical bag clutched tight against her chest. Behind them, the crowd pressed closer to the windows, their faces pale with anticipation. Eleanor closed the door on them all and led her visitors toward the kitchen, where Gabriel waited with 3 cups of coffee already poured and a smile that would change everything. The kitchen fell silent, except for the quiet hiss of steam rising from 3 coffee cups. Sheriff Martinez stopped so abruptly that Dr. Chen nearly collided with his back, both of them staring at the man who sat calmly at Eleanor's breakfast table as if he'd been expecting them for years. Gabriel rose slowly, extending his hand in greeting. "Sheriff Martinez, Dr. Chen, thank you for coming." The simple gesture sent ripples of confusion across both officials' faces. Whatever they'd prepared for, aggression, defensiveness, the wild-eyed ranting of someone unhinged, this quiet courtesy wasn't it. Sheriff Martinez accepted the handshake automatically, then jerked back as if he'd touched a live wire. "Your hands," he whispered. Dr. Chen stepped closer, her medical instincts overriding her caution. "Those scars, they look old, very old. What happened to you?" Gabriel simply smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features into something that made Eleanor's chest tighten with recognition. "I chose love over safety. It left marks." "We need to see some identification," Sheriff Martinez said, recovering his official bearing but unable to stop staring at Gabriel's palms. "Driver's license, social security card, something that tells us who you are." "I am who Eleanor says I am, a man who needed shelter and found someone brave enough to offer it." Gabriel's voice carried that strange resonance again, and Eleanor watched both visitors sway slightly, as if hearing music just beyond their perception. "Is kindness so rare in Cedar Falls that it requires police investigation?" Dr. Chen moved closer, her physician's eye cataloging details. "You're malnourished, dehydrated. When did you last see a doctor?" But even as she spoke, Eleanor could see confusion creeping into her expression. Gabriel's color was good, his breathing steady. Whatever she was seeing didn't match her medical assessment. "I see one now," Gabriel said gently, "and she's exactly where she needs to be." Outside, the crowd pressed against the windows, their faces distorted by glass and morning light. Eleanor could hear muffled voices, someone shouting questions they couldn't answer. But inside her kitchen, time seemed suspended, held in the space between Gabriel's impossible presence and the world's desperate need for ordinary explanations. Sheriff Martinez cleared his throat. "Sir, we've had reports of unusual activities, claims of—" He stopped, clearly struggling with words that felt ridiculous to speak aloud. "Strange occurrences, things that can't be explained, such as—" The simple question hung in the air like a challenge. Eleanor watched Sheriff Martinez grapple with second-hand accounts of healing, of flowers blooming out of season, of a homeless man whose very existence seemed to bend reality around him. "How did you write that into an official report? How did you arrest someone for being impossible?" "People are scared," Dr. Chen said finally. "When they can't understand something, they assume it's dangerous." Gabriel nodded as if this was perfectly reasonable. "And what do you think, Dr. Chen? After examining me, after seeing how Eleanor responds to my presence, what does your training tell you?" Dr. Chen opened her mouth, then closed it again. Eleanor could see the war playing out across her features, medical science battling against something her eyes couldn't deny, but her mind couldn't accept. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I think I don't understand what I'm looking at. That's the beginning of wisdom," Gabriel said softly. Sheriff Martinez stepped forward, his hand moving toward his radio. "I think we need to take this downtown, sort it out in a more controlled environment." "No." Eleanor's voice cut through the kitchen like a blade. Both officials turned to stare at her, and she felt the full weight of the choice she was about to make. "You want to arrest him? Then you arrest me too." "Mrs. Hartwell, that's not necessary." "Isn't it?" Eleanor moved to stand beside Gabriel, her small frame somehow commanding the room's attention. "You think he's dangerous? I brought him here. You think he's delusional? I'm the one who believes him. You want to drag him away from the first real home he's had in who knows how long? Then you'll have to drag me too." Sheriff Martinez's face flushed red. "Ma'am, you're not thinking clearly. Your family is concerned. My family wants me to be small and quiet and grateful for whatever scraps of attention they throw my way." Eleanor's voice rose with 40 years of suppressed frustration. "But I choose this. I choose mystery over certainty. I choose faith over fear. And I choose to stand with someone who reminds me that miracles are possible even when the cost is everything else I thought I wanted." Gabriel's hand found hers, warm and solid and completely human. "Eleanor, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do." She squeezed his fingers, feeling the ancient scars that mapped a story she was only beginning to understand. "This is what love looks like. This is what faith costs. And I'm finally ready to pay it." Outside, the crowd grew louder, sensing climax approaching. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, vibrating with the weight of Eleanor's declaration. Sheriff Martinez's hand hovered near his radio, his training warring with the inexplicable certainty in her voice. Dr. Chen stood frozen, her medical bag forgotten, staring at Gabriel with the expression of someone watching their understanding of the world crumble in real time. Then Gabriel spoke, his voice carrying a gentleness that seemed to fill every corner of the kitchen. "Sheriff Martinez, what if I came willingly? No arrest, no charges. Just a conversation at the station, where everyone can see that I'm exactly what I appear to be, a man grateful for unexpected kindness." The offer caught both officials off guard. Eleanor felt Gabriel's fingers tighten around hers, and she understood what he was doing, removing the weapon of force from their hands, making them choose deliberate cruelty over professional duty. Sheriff Martinez cleared his throat. "That would be acceptable." "Then I'll drive him myself," Eleanor said firmly. "I assume I'm not under arrest for feeding someone breakfast in my own home?" Dr. Chen stepped forward, her voice carefully controlled. "Mrs. Hartwell, before we go anywhere, I need to ask you directly. Do you believe this man is who he claims to be?" The question hung in the air like incense, demanding something more than mere words. Eleanor looked at Gabriel, really looked at him, taking in the weathered face that sometimes seemed ancient beyond measure, the hands that bore scars no medical textbook could explain, the eyes that held depths she was only beginning to fathom. "I believe," she said slowly, "that some questions are more important than their answers. I believe that kindness should never require justification, and I believe that the moment we stop making room for mystery, we stop being fully human." Gabriel's smile was radiant with pride, and for just an instant the kitchen seemed to glow with more than morning sunlight. Dr. Chen blinked hard, her scientific mind struggling to process what her eyes insisted they'd seen. "We should go," Sheriff Martinez said, but his voice had lost its official edge. "Before this gets any more complicated." Outside, the crowd had grown restless, their voices rising in speculation and demand. Eleanor could see Mayor Whitman gesturing frantically, probably fielding phone calls from reporters who'd caught wind of the story. By evening, Cedar Falls would be crawling with news vans and curiosity seekers, all drawn by whispers of miracles and the promise of easy answers. Gabriel rose from the table with unhurried grace, pausing to rinse his coffee cup in the sink, a gesture so ordinary it somehow made everything else more extraordinary. "Thank you, Eleanor, for the shelter, for the trust, for reminding me why I keep hoping." "This isn't goodbye," Eleanor said fiercely. "Whatever happens at that station, this isn't over." Sheriff Martinez opened the back door, clearly hoping to avoid the circus out front. But as they stepped onto Eleanor's small porch, the crowd spotted them and surged around the side of the house like water finding a crack. Phones rose like weapons, recording every moment for social media feeds and news broadcasts that would reduce this moment to sensational fragments. "There he is," someone shouted. "Is it true he can heal people? What did he do to you, Mrs. Hartwell? Are you hurt? Do you need help?" The voices blended into a cacophony of fear and fascination, but Eleanor found herself strangely calm as she walked beside Gabriel toward Sheriff Martinez's patrol car. She could feel the weight of their stares, the hunger in their questions, but none of it touched the quiet certainty that had settled in her chest. Dr. Chen fell into step beside her. "Mrs. Hartwell, I have to ask. Your arthritis. Yesterday you could barely move your fingers. Today—" Eleanor flexed her hands, marveling again at the absence of pain that had been her constant companion for years. "Today I remembered what it feels like to be whole. That's not medically possible. Maybe medicine isn't the only way to measure what's possible," Eleanor replied gently. They reached the patrol car as Mayor Whitman broke through the crowd, his face flushed with exertion and political panic. "Sheriff, I need to know what we're dealing with here. The phones haven't stopped ringing, and I've got reporters calling from Denver asking about miracle healings and religious manifestations." Gabriel paused with his hand on the car door, turning to face the assembled crowd. For a moment, his weathered features seemed to shift, revealing glimpses of something eternal and achingly familiar. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the yard, silencing every whispered speculation. "You want to know who I am?" he said, his words somehow reaching every ear without effort. "I am what happens when love refuses to give up, when hope chooses to walk among broken hearts instead of waiting for perfect faith. I am the answer to prayers you forgot you were praying." Then he was just a tired man climbing into a police car, leaving Cedar Falls to wrestle with the impossible possibility that the divine had been sitting in their cemetery all along, waiting for someone brave enough to offer him lunch. The patrol car disappeared around the corner of Elm Street, leaving Eleanor standing in her front yard surrounded by a crowd that no longer seemed quite sure what they were witnessing. The phones slowly lowered, the urgent whispers died away, and one by one, her neighbors began the awkward retreat to their own lives, carrying questions they couldn't voice and memories they couldn't dismiss. Dr. Chen lingered longest, her medical bag still clutched against her chest like armor. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said quietly, "I don't know what I just saw in there." "Maybe that's enough for now," Eleanor replied, flexing her fingers again in the morning sunlight. The absence of pain still amazed her, not just the physical relief, but the way it had lifted a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Some mysteries don't need solving right away. When the last car pulled away from her street, Eleanor walked back into her house, closing the door on the circus that would inevitably return. The kitchen felt enormous without Gabriel's presence, his coffee cup still sitting in the drying rack like evidence of a dream. But the changes he'd wrought remained. The flowering vines pressed against her windowsill, the sweet ache of hope in her chest, the revolutionary understanding that love was worth any cost. She called Margaret first, knowing word would spread through the family faster than wildfire. "Mom?" Her daughter's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "Are you all right? David said he saw police cars on the news and something about reporters." "I'm fine, sweetheart. More than fine." Eleanor sank into her reading chair, the one by the window where she could watch the cemetery. "But I need you to understand something. I'm not the same person who waved goodbye to you last weekend." The silence stretched long enough that Eleanor wondered if the call had dropped. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice carried the careful patience reserved for handling fragile things. "Mom, David told us about this homeless man, about the things you think happened. We're worried about you, about your judgment." "My judgment is perfect," Eleanor said firmly. "For the first time in years, I'm seeing clearly." "Mom?" "Margaret, listen to me. Really listen. When your father died, I thought faith meant accepting loss gracefully, being grateful for the scraps, making myself smaller so everyone else could be comfortable with my grief." Eleanor's voice grew stronger with each word, but I was wrong. Faith means making room for impossibility. It means choosing mystery over certainty, even when everyone thinks you've lost your mind. She told her daughter about Gabriel's hands, about the flowers that bloomed overnight, about arthritis vanishing like morning mist. She described the way his presence had transformed not just her body, but her understanding of what the world could hold. Margaret listened in growing silence, and Eleanor could almost hear her wrestling with love and fear and the terrible possibility that her practical mother had finally broken. "What do you need from us?" Margaret asked finally, and Eleanor's heart swelled at the careful phrasing. Not what do you need from me, but us, the whole family, circling wagons around their changed matriarch. I need you to trust me, even if you can't understand, even if it looks like I'm choosing a stranger over my own family. Eleanor's voice softened. And I need you to know that whatever happens next, I'm not afraid anymore. The phone calls that followed were harder. David, furious and frightened, threatening to contest her mental capacity. Susan, weeping and begging her to come stay with them until this madness passed. Each conversation required her to choose again, the safe harbor of family expectations or the wild territory of transformed faith. By afternoon, Eleanor had made her decision. She called Sheriff Martinez directly. "Mrs. Hartwell," his voice was carefully neutral. "Gabriel he's not under arrest. We've got no charges to hold him on. But he's asked to stay until tomorrow, says he has something to finish here. I want to see him." "Ma'am, I'm not sure that's—" "Sheriff Martinez," Eleanor interrupted, using the voice that had controlled rowdy classrooms for 4 decades. "I'm 67 years old, I'm of sound mind, and I'm asking to visit someone who is not under arrest. Unless Cedar Falls has become a police state while I wasn't looking." A long pause. "Visiting hours start at 6. Eleanor arrived at the station as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of glory that seemed appropriate for what felt like a pilgrimage. Gabriel was sitting in the small conference room they used for interviews, his hands folded peacefully on the scarred table. When he saw her through the glass, his smile was radiant with welcome. "I knew you'd come," he said as she sat across from him. "You couldn't stay away from mystery once you'd tasted it." Eleanor reached across the table, covering his scarred hands with her pain-free ones. "Tell me what happens now. Tell me how this story ends." Gabriel's eyes held depths that seemed to encompass every sunset, every prayer, every moment of perfect love the world had ever known. "It doesn't end, Eleanor. It begins." "Begins with what?" Eleanor asked, though part of her already knew. She could feel it in the quiet certainty that had settled in her bones, in the way her transformed hands held his scarred ones without trembling. "With you," Gabriel said simply, "with the choice you made to see love instead of madness, with every person who heard my words today and felt something shift inside them, even if they can't name it yet." Through the conference room window, Eleanor could see Sheriff Martinez at his desk, methodically typing a report that would never capture what had really happened. "How did you document the moment when certainty cracked open to let mystery in? How did you file a report about hope made manifest?" "The reporters will come," she said. "They'll want explanations, proof, evidence that can be measured and verified." Gabriel's smile was gentle. "And what will you tell them?" Eleanor considered this, watching the last light fade from the sky beyond the station windows. "I'll tell them about Lucy and Thomas, sharing their lunch with a stranger because kindness felt more important than fear. I'll tell them about flowers blooming in November, about pain disappearing, about the revolutionary idea that love might be the most practical force in the universe. And they'll call you delusional, probably." Eleanor squeezed his hands. "But that's their burden to carry, not mine." Sheriff Martinez appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm sorry, but visiting hours are over." Gabriel rose gracefully, but his eyes never left Eleanor's face. "Tomorrow morning, I'll be gone. Not because they're forcing me to leave, but because the work here is finished." Eleanor felt something fracture in her chest, not pain, but the breaking open that comes before transformation. "Where will you go?" "Wherever love is needed, wherever someone is brave enough to choose mystery over safety." He touched her cheek with fingers that carried the warmth of every answered prayer. "But I'm not really leaving, Eleanor. You'll carry me with you. In every moment you choose faith over fear, in every kindness you offer without calculating the cost, in every time you look at the impossible and say yes instead of prove it. Sheriff Martinez cleared his throat. "Ma'am?" Eleanor stood slowly, her arthritis-free joints moving with a grace she'd forgotten she possessed. "Thank you," she said to Gabriel, though the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what had passed between them. "Thank you," he replied, and somehow she knew he meant it. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the station to find Gabriel's room empty, the only evidence of his presence a single white flower lying on the windowsill, a bloom that shouldn't exist in Colorado's November chill but somehow did anyway. Sheriff Martinez found her standing there staring at the impossible blossom. "He left about an hour ago," he said quietly. "Walked out those doors like any other man being released. But Mrs. Hartwell—" He paused, struggling with words. "My arthritis, it's gone too. Disappeared sometime during the night." Eleanor picked up the flower, inhaling its sweet fragrance. "What will you put in your report?" "That we questioned a transient and released him for lack of evidence of wrongdoing." Sheriff Martinez's voice carried a new note, not quite belief, but something softer than skepticism. "But privately, I'll remember that some mysteries don't need solving. They just need witnessing." By the time Eleanor returned home, the reporters had indeed arrived, setting up their cameras and asking their urgent questions about miracles and manifestations. She answered them with perfect honesty, describing everything she'd seen and felt and chosen, watching their faces cycle through fascination and doubt and the peculiar hunger that comes from touching the edge of something impossible. They left disappointed, carrying fragments of story that would never quite add up to the truth they'd hoped to capture. Eleanor spent the afternoon in her garden, where Gabriel's impossible flowers continued to bloom, despite the frost warning on the radio. Margaret called twice, David once, each conversation a small bridge built across the chasm between old Eleanor and the woman she'd become. As evening fell, she sat in her reading chair by the window, watching the cemetery where this all began. Lucy and Thomas were there with their mother, placing fresh flowers on their grandfather's grave. When they spotted Eleanor in her window, they waved with the unself-conscious joy of children who understood that some gifts were meant to be shared without question. Eleanor waved back, her pain-free hands moving with fluid grace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices between safety and mystery, between the comfortable certainty of the old life and the wild possibility of the new. Her family would continue to worry, her neighbors would continue to whisper, and the world would continue its ancient struggle between faith and doubt. But tonight, Eleanor Hartwell sat in the glow of impossible flowers and knew with perfect certainty that love had walked among them, had chosen her table for breakfast, had reminded them all that miracles were not violations of natural law, but love made visible. The story had ended exactly as it began, with choice, with mystery, with the revolutionary understanding that the divine was always waiting in the spaces between certainty and hope. It was enough. It was everything. It was just the beginning.